This is the web transmission service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. On September the 26th, a special speaker's dinner honored RCMP Inspector Ken Burton, who took the RCMP vessel St. Roch II through the Northwest Passage and around North America in 2000. He told the stories of St. Roch I and II, and offered some thoughts on Arctic sovereignty in an unstable international order.
It's indeed my pleasure to be your MC, your Master of Ceremonies tonight. And again, my name is Craig Hannaford. I'm on the board of directors of the RCMI, and I'm your host for this evening. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce you to our guest speaker for this evening. It's especially a treat for me because Inspector Ken Burton, or depends what you're looking at, Captain Ken Burton, and I were in the same training troop at the RCMP Academy way back in 1981. And in fact, we were pitmates together at the RCMP Depot Division. So that's kind of interesting. After graduation from the RCMP Academy, we went our separate ways. Ken cut his teeth in policing in British Columbia and went on to serve on the RCMP underwater recovery team and also as an RCMP patrol vessel commander. In my opinion, one of the highlights of Ken's stellar career is when he skippered the St. Roch II, which was an RCMP patrol vessel. Ken and his crew recreated the historic voyage of the original St. Roch, which circumvented North America, and recreated that voyage, which took place in the 1950s. So that was a very interesting voyage. The first time any vessel had circumvented North America, and Ken recreated that in the St. Roch II. I know he's going to give you a few stories about that adventure. Ken's experience in the northern Canada, gives him a very unique perspective about the Northwest Passage and the challenges up there to Canada's sovereignty from other state actors. And believe me, there are lots of challenges. As the world continues to warm, the Northwest Passage is becoming a strategically important place. Ken is a recipient of the RCMP Long Service Medal, the SS Beaver Medal for outstanding contribution to British Columbia's maritime sector. He's also a fellow of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society and an international fellow of the Explorers Club. Ladies and gentlemen, my troop mate, Inspector or Captain Ken Burton.
Now in the US there's the old FBI to catch out those nasty red Russians that spy. But up here in Canada it's plain to see we're safe in the hands of the RCMP. The RCMP, the RCMP, we're safe in the hands of the RCMP.
Oh my God.
Sorry about that. That arrived at the last minute to be put in. So, and that is Craig Hannaford, of course, and myself, and it's skinny young men from 42 years ago. Yeah, so thank you very much for having me here tonight. I deeply appreciate it. And I feel like I'm coming home. I actually started my professional career just down the road. I did medical documentary films at Toronto Western Hospital. As a matter of fact, that's where I started. And I got interested in forensic photography because the forensic lab is just down the road. And I am originally from Orillia, which is just up the road. So I really feel like I'm at home. But one day, many years ago, I got in the wrong lineup being fingerprinted. And they gave me a one-way ticket to Regina and a gun when I got there. And lo and behold, I joined the RCMP. What can I say? So the poor folks here thought this presentation was going to be a little schizophrenic because I'm kind of squeezing together a couple of different topics. The original St. Roch, what I did with the St. Roch, and what is happening in the Arctic today. So I'm going to try to put it together. I may be jumping around, and given the makeup of this audience, I'm probably going to tell a few stories, which I hope you find amusing, which normally don't get presented to a regular group. So, the North is the only place where nature can still claim to rule. The only place is yet but a little vexed by man. All over the globe, there spread noisy features. The North is silent and at peace. For now. But it's not going to last. Stephen Leacock, one of my favorite authors, and of course, he spent a good deal of his time in Aurelia, Sunshine Sketches of Little Town, Mariposa. So very near and dear to my heart. This picture was taken about 3 weeks ago on Beachy Island, and that is the Franklin Memorial. Looking out across to where Riley Point is, which is where explorers found the coal deposits while searching for Sir John Franklin. And we're going to touch a little bit on Sir John Franklin today too, and some of my adventures in the North. But I've been going into the Arctic now for over 30 years. It's hard to imagine that I'd started off as a photographer down the road, joined the Mounties, ended up in a dive team working on a boat, ended up as the skipper, ended up traveling through the Arctic. And now, and certainly for the last 8 years, I've been doing expedition tour guiding, spending my summers in the high Arctic, the winters in the Antarctic, and the shoulder season in either Greenland, Iceland, or the Caribbean. So there is life out there. There is really life when you retire. And I tell people I have a hard time keeping a job, but it is the way it is. So I go into the Arctic now for the silence, but it's really not a very quiet world. The ice floats in an ocean over 6 million square miles of ice, which is melting. It's full of icebergs, pan ice, names like Bergy Bits and Growlers, confined by Russia, Canada, United States, Norway, and Denmark. It's a land with amazing creatures: polar bears, seals, muskox, narwhal, baby belugas, bowhead whales, and killer whales. If you know where to look, it's everywhere in the Arctic. Very, very rich in resources. And bears, probably one of my very favorite. I actually remember talking to that fellow and I said, "What's it like to hunt polar bear?" And he looked up at me with a big grin, big toothless grin, and said, "You don't hunt polar bear. Polar bear hunt you." And he's right. Polar bear will actually stalk humans. So a lot of my time in the Arctic is spent watching for bears to make sure none of the folks on board ship have a bad bear experience. And touch wood, I've been very lucky. But there's more to the North, and Craig touched on it a little bit. And part of that is the Northwest Passage. So what's the big deal? Well, it's not just the Northwest Passage, but for our sake right here, this slide, if you remember that if you can go through the Northwest Passage in a trip from Europe to Asia, you cut the distance by 50%. It was so important that in 1741, the British government, the document you see on the left, enacted the Northwest Passage Act, which offered 20,000 pounds sterling to the person that can find and discover the Northwest Passage. And it ultimately was discovered during a search for Franklin by a guy named McClure, who didn't sail it. He was near Melville Island in the wintertime. He climbed up to the top of the hill. He looked off in the distance and he went, "Oh my goodness, that's Beachy Island over there. This is the Northwest Passage." So he claimed the award. And the British Admiralty said, "Well, you didn't really sail it. You actually walked it. And that doesn't count. And to make matters worse, you left the Resolute and the Investigator, two of our prime ships, locked in ice somewhere in the Western Arctic." That Resolute, by the way, eventually broke free and became a derelict vessel floating down the East Coast that was picked up by a whaling vessel and returned to the United States, subsequently returned to Britain. And that's where the Resolute desk comes from. It was a gift from Britain to the people of America for recovering the Resolute. Anyhow, I digress. I'm going to do that. I'm going to do that a lot tonight, so apologies. So they didn't give him the 20,000 pounds. They gave him 10,000 pounds. Said, "There you go, you walked it." And he said, okay, thanks very much. And he didn't share it with his crew. He took the money and ran. Now, the last stanza in the Northwest Passage Act says, regardless who finds it, it's all the property of what was to become the Hudson's Bay Company, which is a certain poignant part there because Hudson's Bay Company is now owned, I think, by Saks. So the North is now owned by Saks. And when you think about the development of the Arctic, you think about the Hudson's Bay Company, it's because they had a royal decree which said they own the Northwest Passage and all the riches from coast to coast. Biggest land grab in history. So let's take a peek, at least from my perspective, of a circumpolar glimpse of the Arctic. So there's various islands and archipelagos separated from one another in the Canadian mainland in a series of Arctic waterways, collectively known as the Northwest Passage or the Northwestern Passage. But there's more. There's the Northeastern Sea Route, which goes over the top of Russia. You ever wonder why Norway is called Norway? Norway means the North Way. The North Way, up to the Northeast Passage. And there's also the Transpolar Route, which cuts right across the North Pole. So what does it mean in terms of understanding the importance of the passages up there? A journey from Asia through the Bering Straits and across to Europe would be 7,000 nautical miles, almost 50% shorter than going around the Indian Ocean routing. But not only is it shorter, there's no levies, there's no agencies, there's no authorities to ensure that you have load lines. So you can load up as much as you want. If you were going through the Northeast Passage, for example, from the top of Russia around to the Kamchatka Peninsula, you're staying in Russian waters, you can take whatever kind of vessel you want. Maybe it's a nuclear powered. You don't have to worry about canal authorities, the Panama or the Suez Canal. You don't have to worry about other regulatory bodies. You can move freight and people freely through international waterways, and there's no one there to stop you. So to give you an idea of what that means in terms of real total value, so this is a 2013 Nordic Orion. It actually left from Vancouver. They were on the way to Finland. They saved $80,000 in fuel cost. They carried 25% more cargo, departed Vancouver on the 6th of September, and arrived in Finland on the 9th of October, assisted by the Coast Guard. Tremendous savings. Don't have to worry about load lines. Don't have to worry about what you're carrying. You can just go. Passenger ships have begun plying the Northwest Passage. In 2016, I was working on the Crystal Serenity as a guide. 1,000 guests, 600 crew, west to east through the Northwest Passage, from Anchorage, Alaska, all the way around through to New York. Now, I first went through the Northwest Passage, the complete passage, in the year 2000. And I thought to myself, my grandchildren are going to see an ice-free passage. Maybe my children will see an ice-free passage. I could not have believed that a brief 16 years later, on board that vessel, we had to go looking for ice for the film crew. The ice was going, and it's going that fast. When I went through in the year 2000, I was the 74th vessel in all of history to go through. That was in the year 2000, so it's 24 years ago. Since then, there's been 319 additional vessels have done the Northwest Passage. So all of history, 74, in the last 25 years, 320. And that doesn't count this year. Scott Polar Institute keeps track of them. If you're curious about who's going through the Northwest Passage, just go to the Scott Polar Institute, type up Northwest Passage transits, and they give you all the information, who went through, what years, what kind of vessels, and what they were doing. But it's frightening when you think about that. So the first vessel through was Concord Roald Amundsen, 1903, 1906, in a small fishing vessel called the Yo. And they did it in a 3-year time period. Now, living in the Arctic and living there for the last 8,000 years were the Inuit. And I love this poster because it says Eskimos, he's talking to the priest. He says, if I did not know about God and sin, would I go to hell? And the priest says, well, no, not if you didn't know. The Eskimo says, well, why did you tell me anyhow? You shouldn't have told me that. But the term for the Eskimo is actually Inuit, is the proper term. The term Eskimo is a derogatory Cree term, which means eaters of raw meat. So they prefer the term Inuit. And although you do have Greenland Eskimos and you do have Alaska Eskimos, in Canada it is Inuit. And the story of the Inuit in the high Arctic is a story of the Hudson's Bay Company, who would move in and set up a trading post, a fur post for the trappers. The Inuit would come to the post. The church would show up, both the Anglican and the Catholic Church, depending on the community, followed by the RCMP. So the churches brought in different styles of writing. So there's actually two different forms of writing in the high Arctic, along with French and English. So it makes applying for permits really interesting because you have to fight through all of those terms. And the RCMP were up there really to collect the fur tax and to tend to the needs and wants as perceived by Ottawa of the Inuit. So let's talk about the Royal Canadian Mounted Police patrol vessel St. Roch. The St. Roch was built and launched in 1928. It's 104 feet long, had a whopping 150 horsepower Union diesel. It was upgraded to 300 horsepower in 1942. The top speed of 3 knots, on a good day 7 knots if the sails were up. Displacement of 323 tons with a draft of about 12 feet. The height of the mast was 62 feet off the water. Now this ship it had a rounded hull. It was based on the Fram, and it was based on other Arctic vessels, which were good in the Arctic because as it froze, the ice would freeze around and lift the boat up out of the water. But it made it a very tender boat. And Larson used to joke he'd be in the very top of the mast and the boat would be rolling so much he could slap the water on one hand and the boat would roll the other way and he could slap the water the other way. Which brings us to Henry Larson. So Henry Larson was raised in Norway near the mouth of the Oslo Fjord. He went to sea at 15 years of age. He became known as Henry Ullakak, Henry with the big ship. And Henry Larson wasn't a police officer, he was a sailor. And he spent 4 years in the Arctic before he was searched out and hired by the RCMP to work on this new concept of a patrol vessel, a patrol cabin, a police presence in the high north. And Henry Larson's motto was, "Ours is a force not to be feared." And that sits at the very top of his memoir. And I think that people in today's policing environment, if that was their motto, then how things would be different. But he wasn't the first captain of the St. Roch, he was actually the third. The first captain wanted to bring his wife along with him. This is an RCMP boat. And he said, "No, you're not going to do that." Second captain delivered the boat, and Henry Larson became the third captain and went through history right up. He served from 1928 to about 1962 when he retired as a superintendent in charge of the Arctic regions. And in that time, the St. Roch patrolled and served as a support vessel, supplied detachments, moved personnel around. You know, there was no Coast Guard. The military was certainly not operating in the Arctic at the time. And the Government of Canada boats, the first Government of Canada boat didn't show up there until the 50s and to exert government policy in the high north. And that didn't work out so well with Inuit relocations and a few other horror stories that started in the 50s. So the time period for Henry Larson here from 1928 to 1950 is kind of a unique time in Canadian history because he worked very, very closely with the Inuit. I mean, this was a vessel that was built in Vancouver. It was crewed by farm boys from all across Canada. It was named for a small Quebec parish, the parish of St. Roch. It was skippered by an immigrant, and it was successful in the service in the far north with the help of the Inuit. They would conduct epic 1,200-mile dog sled patrols, doing census, acting as post office, being a dentist, being a doctor, doing enumerations. And they also went to where previous explorers from other parts of the world had explored the Arctic, and they felt compelled to rifle through any cairns and then remains, and he gathered up all the papers and documentation of other explorers in the far north and shipped it off to Ottawa. They hunted and they fished as required. They said if it flew or had fin or feathers, it went into the pot. Now, they did have enough supplies for 3 years, but it was quite a rough, rugged existence. And to help them along, they hired an Inuit guide, Joseph Panapukachu. And when Joseph showed up, he brought his wife, his mother-in-law, and his 3 kids. They showed up on the boat. And so the wives and the women went to work stitching up clothing, mostly seal clothing, bear clothing for the RCMP members. But they didn't want to stay inside the ship. It stunk too bad. They said, this is really foul smelling in this ship. And they elected to sleep in a tent on the deck. So if you visit the St. Roch today, you see the Panapukachu tent set up with the children's toys. And I got to meet 2 of the children in my travels. They've since passed away. And they tell fascinating stories about what life was like as a small child roaming the Arctic with Henry Larson and his big ship and patrolling and helping where they could. And they really did that. They helped more than you can really imagine or picture police doing that in this day and age. But then something happened in 1940. So in 1940, the St. Roch was ordered from Vancouver to Halifax through the Northwest Passage. Now, the reason that they were sent through was not revealed until 1995. It was a secret wartime mission to form part of an invasion group to guard, protect, and secure cryolite and bauxite mines in Western Greenland. And the cryolite and bauxite mines were critical war materials for the smelters in Arvida, Quebec, the Alcan smelters that were smelting aluminum as part of the war effort. When they left, only Henry Larson and the first officer knew where they were going. He didn't tell the crew where they were going until they got to the Aleutian Islands, and then all the crew stayed with him. And Henry Larson said, I think it's going to take us 3 months. 3 months we'll be through because we have to get to Western Greenland. Ladies and gentlemen, it took them 2.5 years. They spent 2 years locked in Arctic ice while the war raged south of them. And ultimately, the United States Pearl Harbor was bombed, the Americans got dragged into the war, and the Americans secured the cryolite and bauxite mines. But the reason they were sent through was a military mission. Hard to imagine. So you're working up there in an area that had no charts, no maps. You couldn't use your compass. You're too close to the magnetic North Pole. You had no idea how deep it was. Someone was spending his entire days throwing a lead line out to measure the depth. Incredible hardships. Living up there with a crew of 8, sometimes 6, sometimes 10, depending if they were moving people around. There were no tide calculations. In fact, for the longest time, they carried a jar of mercury, liquid mercury, in the wheelhouse because there's so much fog in the high Arctic. You have a hard time getting an eye on the horizon, and they would pour the mercury into a saucer. I can't imagine health and safety would approve of this today. And they would hold the saucer up close to form an artificial horizon so they could do a sextant measurement to find out where they were. Remarkable navigation. All of that on top of dealing with the ice, which was extremely challenging. And again, there's no ice reconnaissance, there's no weather forecasting. They did it by pure grit, pure gut, pure determination. Really, in my mind, rendered heroic at the top of the world for this feat alone. And their downtime was very limited. Here's Ted Ferrier. He's out there, he's using a radio. Now, back during the St. Roch, and this is in the 40s, it would take him 6 to 8 weeks to get a message sent to Ottawa and get a reply back. When I went through in the year 2000, it was taking me 6 months. So I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Communications has always been a problem. But you can see his guns there because polar bears are a constant threat. And there was no shower on the St. Roch. So I guess the tub was in order for him. So he was sitting there playing with his radio, having a tub. They had a cook, Dad Perry. And I got to talk to 2 of the survivors, a guy named Bill Cashin and Dean Hadley. And I asked him, what did you miss most about being on the St. Roch in this time period? And he said, well, fresh vegetables and bread. And I said, well, you had to cook. You must be able to make bread. He said, no, it never got warm enough for the bread to rise. So no bread. They had one death. Albert Frenchy Chartrand died of a heart attack in 1942, and he's buried in a place called Paisley Bay. In fact, there's about 14 RCMP members buried all across the Arctic, and I've tried through the years to visit their graves. And I'm proud to say that every year, and it's usually driven by military patrols into the high Arctic, go in and tend to the graves, make sure they haven't been disturbed. The polar bears will get in, they'll root through everything, and they make it right. So thanks to the military for doing that. Sometimes it's RCMP, but more often than not, it's been military. This is the loneliest place in the world to be buried. After he died, Henry Larson did an 800-mile trip to find a Catholic priest to come back to officiate over the burial. And that's the way it looks pretty much today. Visited by almost nobody in a little place called Paisley Bay. So they lived and they traveled in the Arctic, they mapped and they explored, and they really became friends with the Inuit. And I can't really, it's hard to put that in words. I didn't realize the impact they had on them until I went to the Arctic in the St. Roch II and was able to meet and talk with a lot of the folks. So the St. Roch was the first vessel to conquer the Northwest Passage from the west to east, and they did that in 1940 to 42. That's the military mission. It was the first to return, so they went from Vancouver to Halifax. They got upgraded, a 300 horsepower diesel engine, and they came back through the more northerly Deepwater Northwest Passage route. Ladies and gentlemen, that's the route that the explorers had been searching for over 800 years, the Deepwater Northwest Passage route. And they did it, and they did it in 86 days. So Larson wasn't far off when he said he can do it in 90 days, but so he didn't get iced in this time. It went on to be the first vessel to circumnavigate North America, and he did that in 1954. So you have to think about that. There's people in this room that were born in the 1950s, early 50s. I'm not far off. I was born in 1958. So less than one generation later, in 1969, man was standing on the moon. But the first circumnavigation didn't happen until 1954. Ultimately, in 1958, it came back from Halifax, this time through the Panama Canal. And there was a great story about the St. Roch sailing around Halifax in war times, frantically trying to find where their flags were to alert the aircraft that were flying over that they weren't an enemy vessel, because the flag's been put away for 2 years. But they made it back into Vancouver, and now it forms part of the cornerstone of the Vancouver Maritime Museum. And I'm proud to say that when I retired from the RCMP, I actually became the executive director here at the Vancouver Maritime Museum, and was there for many, many years. So now Henry Larson looks back, looks over at us as visitors come and experience what St. Roch was like. And I mentioned this at the table tonight, and I said it's all about artifacts, and you never really know when something's going to hit you. Walking around here and seeing the artifacts there, what got me really, really hooked was about 30 years ago, I'm on the St. Roch, and I go into the galley, and the galley is set up the way it was in 1944, and there was an elderly gentleman, and he was shaking, and he was crying, and he was sitting at the table. And I went over to him. I thought he was having a heart attack. Are you okay? Is there anything I can do? And he's pointing, frantically pointing at the cabinet. And I said, what? He said, it's the Klim. And Klim, K-L-I-M, is powdered milk. And I said, yeah, it's a can of Klim powdered milk. He said, no, you don't understand. He said, I was a prisoner of war. And every week when the Red Cross pass just came, I opened the box, and there on top was a can of Klim freeze-dried milk. And I went, these museums can be a good thing. They generate a lot of memories. So that brought my interest along. So much so that in 1996, a bunch of us were sitting around, so now I'm going to tell some tales. I think the statute of limitations has expired. And the talk was, what are you going to do for the millennium? What are you folks going to do for a limit? I'm sure you had the same talk. Besides sitting at home looking at your computer, wondering what's going to happen. And I was enjoying some Robert McCallum, some of the finest Robert McCallum there is. And somebody asked me, what are you going to do, Ken? And I said, I've been thinking, I'd kind of like to take an RCMP patrol boat and retrace the voyages of St. Roch. Oh, okay, that's good, that's nice. And we all went around, and I should say there was a very attractive young lady from the Maritime Museum sitting in the crowd, sort of taking notes. And about 2 months later, she gives me a call. And she said, were you serious about that? And I said, absolutely, I think. Yeah, sure, I was serious. And she said, well, good, I've talked to some of your senior management, and they think it's a pretty good idea. Uh-oh. Because the deal was to take one of our RCMP patrol boats through the Northwest Passage. And our boats, the ones I ran, were nothing like the St. Roch. These are high-speed, all-welded, light aluminum, 19.5 meters long, with harness and surface-piercing propellers that raise and lower through the water system, has a top speed of about 28 knots, a normal cruise at 18 knots, can take no ice, none, zero. And I'm not sure what I've gotten myself into, because now it's 97, and some of the senior management of the RCMP say, that sounds like a pretty good Millennium project, Ken. What do you think? And I'm going, I'm okay. Well, yeah, let me get back to you on that. So I'm sitting here pondering that, because there's 6 million square miles of ice out there that will crush this aluminum boat like a beer can. But I got a phone call one day, and the fellow on the other end said, hi, my name is David Johns. I said, yes. And he said, I used to be an RCMP Marine member. And I said, well, when did you retire from the RCMP Marine? He said, well, 1960. And I went, wait a minute, I was born in 1958. I said, what have you been doing for the last 40 years? He said, well, I just retired as Director General of the ice operations for the Canadian Coast Guard. And David Johns became my new best friend. And he said, you know what? All that 6 million square miles of ice, it's deep. It's underwater. You're only seeing a little bit. It grounds out. And all the way along the north slope of Alaska, you have a chain of little sandbar islands. Your vessel, your aluminum vessel, only draws 1 meter. Actually, it could draw less than 1 meter if you know what you're doing. He said, you should be able to hug the shore all the way along there without any problem. The secret is your shallow draft. So I think maybe we can do this. So I began putting a project together with very specific goals. Make the St. Roch story, tell a worldwide audience about the St. Roch story. Celebrate the Millennium. Herb Gray, who was head of the Millennium Bureau at the time as the Deputy Prime Minister, was one of our strongest supporters. An absolute gentleman, in my mind. He met with him many, many times, and they helped fund this, because this was to be cost neutral to the RCMP. In other words, the museum's got to foot the bill, sponsors have to foot the bill, the government has to foot the bill, the RCMP can't foot the bill out of operational policing. It was to highlight Canadian industry in the marine sector, welcome Nunavut into Confederation, provide funds for the St. Roch, execute a high Arctic science on warming and global warming, search for the Erebus and Terror with state-of-the-art sector sonar from a company called Kongsberg Simrad Mesotech, which has their research offices just outside of Vancouver. And I'm thinking, a lot of goals, we'll see what we can do. So, the Coast Guard is actually the master in the Arctic now. The Coast Guard runs and controls what's happening in the Arctic. And in 1997, I happened to be delivering a paper at the Changi International, the Singapore Aviation Academy in Changi in Singapore. And I'll be honest with you, okay, I had a jug of whiskey. I had a jug of whiskey with me. And I was looking for ice. Now, ice is a rare thing in Singapore. It's really hard to know where you get ice. Now, Changi Airport is huge. It's a huge complex. There's got to be ice here somewhere. And I'm flipping through the guest speakers, and I see there's a guy named Captain Gary Sidock, who's Canadian Coast Guard, and he's an ice master. And I go, yeah, he'll know where the ice is. He's an ice master. So I go up and I knock on his door. There's no answer. I leave my business card. I think I was a corporal then. Corporal Ken Burton. He's giving me a call. Put it in his door. And I go looking for an ice machine around Singapore, which don't exist. And I go down to the front desk and I phone Gary's room. It's Corporal Ken Burton. Give me a call when you get in. I'd like to chat. And I'm wandering around. And after about an hour and a half, I figured, it's about time I went back to see how Gary's doing and see if he's back in his room yet. So I go up and I knock on his door, and this frantic door opens up, and this frantic man's looking at me. He's all bug-eyed, and he goes, "What? What?" And I said, "Are you Captain Sidak?" He goes, "Yeah." I said, "I'm Ken Burton." He goes, "Yes, yes. What's wrong? What's wrong?" And I'm saying, "Nothing. I'm looking for some ice and someone to have a drink with." And he looked at me and he said, "Do you know what I do?" And I said, "You're an ice master?" He said, "I'm head of search and rescue for all of Canada. And there's a note on my door that the RCMP are looking for me." He said, "Holy Christ." He said, "I phoned the Coast Guard in Ottawa to find out what's happening. They don't know what's happening. The Coast Guard phones the RCMP Emergency Operations Center in Ottawa to say, what's wrong? Because there's one of your guys that's looking for our head of search and rescue." And they go, "I'll get back to you on that." Now they phone Vancouver to our Emergency Operations Center, and the people know me in Vancouver, and they know I had done undercover work. And they said, "Well, we're not at liberty to say." They didn't know I was in Singapore. I was one of those, when I got back, "Dear Commissioner, in regards to," this is a statement of, yeah, hey, you get the picture. Anyhow, so this went back and forth between the RCMP, the Coast Guard, External Affairs, and the embassy in Singapore, wondering why I'm looking for Gary Sidak. And I had to tell the commissioner because I wanted some ice. And he was an ice master. So we got some ice because he was an ice master. We drank most of the scotch, and I said, "You know, Gary, someday I may need to borrow an icebreaker." Now, it's very easy if you're in the military, if you're in the Army, you can say, "Yeah, sure, help yourself to all the planes you want." If you're in the Air Force, you can say, "Yeah, help yourself to all the tanks you want." And you're head of Coast Guard, you can say, "Sure, you can have all the icebreakers you want, no problem." Didn't think much of it. And about a year later, the RCMP comes to me and says, "Ken, you're going to need an icebreaker." I know where to get one. So I phoned Gary. I said, "Gary," and he went, "Oh, yes." He said, "You remember that I want to borrow an icebreaker?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "Can I borrow an icebreaker?" He said, "Do you know what I do now?" And I said, I have no idea." He said, "I'm in charge of the Canadian Coast Guard icebreaker fleet." And I got the Simon Fraser. He said, "This vessel is just coming out of service. You have to charter it. You have to pay for it. You have to crew it. You have to fuel it. But if you want it, we'll do a bareboat charter and you can have it." So I got an icebreaker. Amazing what you can do with a jug of scotch in Singapore. So we had to come up with a crew, and we relied on our supporters and sponsors. Consberg, Simrad, Mesoltech, Alcan, Man Diesel, Inmarsat, Cobalt Controls, Esso, Arneson Drive, goes on and on and on. No cost to the RCMP. And one brief story about rounding up sponsors. I happened to be at the Fort Lauderdale Boat Show. I'm there with a group, and we're in Red Surge because we're promoting the St. Roch project. And the convention center is right across the laneway from the hotel. So I figure it's probably okay to nip between the hotel and the convention center in Red Surge. You know, it's not very far. I can do it because it's a real hassle to change. And while I'm there, a fellow comes up and says, "Hi, I'm with Arneson Drive Systems." We didn't have Arneson Drive Systems on our ship at that time. He said, "We'd like to put Arneson Drives on your boat for the voyage." And I said, "Well, thank you very much, but we already got something, and 7 or 8 weeks out from the time we're leaving, so I don't see how it's going to work." He disappointed and walked away. And about 20 minutes later, another gentleman comes up and says, "Hi, I'm president of Arneson Drive Systems, and we'd like to put our drive systems on your boat." And I went, "Well, you know, we're 6 weeks out and we can't do it, and thank you very much, appreciate the interest, yada, yada, yada." And about 20 minutes after that, this little stocky engineer come up to me, and he held out his hands, this big ham hock of fingers, and shakes my hand. And he says, "My name's Howard Arneson. What would it take for us to put a drive system on your ship?" And I said, "With all due respect, Mr. Arneson, it would take 2 ASD-12 transmission systems, 4 France-Solis propellers, delivered and installed in 4 weeks in Vancouver, and $50,000 cash." And he looked at me and said, "Is that all?" And I said, "I should have asked for 100. He goes, "You should have asked for 100. And he shook my hand, and you know what? We did it. So we wanted to go out and celebrate, because that's a pretty big cash donation. It was very kind of him. And So I scoot across the laneway and I go into the back of the White Law Hotel, which has a huge lobby that's open up in the afternoon for social events and wining and dining and drinking. And it also happens to be the center of the fetish, gay, lesbian, alternative lifestyle community in South Beach. And I'm in red serge, boots and breeks, leather with spurs, walking on a white marble floor. I was undressed so many times through that hallway. So I scooted as fast as I could, got in, got changed, went out, grabbed one of our partners, got out, and I said, I think we should have a cigar to celebrate. And while I'm window shopping, my partner, who will remain nameless, he shows up and he's got 2 boxes of cigars. And I said, oh, you already got some cigars. That's good. I was looking for one, we got 2 boxes. He said, yeah, they're $10 a piece. I said, $10 for each cigar, right? And he goes, no, $10 for the box. And I looked, and I said, where'd you get him? He said, the guy was selling them at the corner. I said, right around the corner from the cigar store? And he said, yeah. He said, we shouldn't go into that store with these boxes. I'm going, they're probably stolen. Now what are we gonna do? Anyhow, so we leave one of the boxes of cigars down at Man Diesel, and somehow the other box of cigars ended up in the other fellow's luggage and ended up back in Canada and was stowed away on the boat. So you have to remember that there's now cigars on the patrol boat. There's no smoking on the patrol boats. And about a week to 2 before departure, we're shooting for July 1st departure, mid-June, I get notified that the Senior Executive Committee and senior management and business and political people are holding a dinner at the Vancouver Yacht Club, and they are requesting an afternoon cruise of the harbor in the St. Roch II, one of the aluminum catamarans, the Dawn, the one I'm taking. So I said, yeah, that should be fine. We can arrange that. We don't really do cruises, but it's all the senior management. Craig, you probably know a lot of these people. And now I have a media thing, and so I'm not going to be there. So I give one of the young ladies at the museum a credit card. I say, can you go grab some refreshments? Not the same person that picked up the cigars, different person. So she scoots off to Granville Line and picks up some supplies and brings them back on the boat. And I show up about 20 minutes before we're to leave, and everyone's getting comfortable. The shirts are getting unbuttoned, they're putting their feet up, and I hear psh, 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 and it's cans being popped open. And I look down, and it's Granville Island lager beer. It's beer. And I went, oh no, they're drinking on the boat in the middle of the Vancouver Yacht Club, and oh, it's not too bad. It's a hot day, they're all adults, they're over 18. My boss is there and he's looking at me going, we're gonna have to have a talk about this. And I go, oh, whatever. So I start the boat up and we leave, and I look down and one of our staff are handing out cigars. So there I sit with most of the senior executive committee of the RCMP and all the politicians drinking beer on a police boat and smoking stolen cigars. Oh, so the boss looks at me, and on the way out, he says, can you come and see me tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock in my office, please? Now, he doesn't know about the cigars. He knows about the beer. So I get there, and he was a pretty decent guy. Don had a big book of the Urine Deep Kaka book. And if you got in that book, you were in trouble. And I walk into his office, and he's got the book out. And he said, okay, so tell me the story. And I said, I told him what happened. I said, it was an honest mistake. And he's thinking about it, and he said, is there anything else I should know about? And I said, well, there is something else. And I said, you want the good news or the bad news? And he said, well, give me the bad news first. What's the bad news? I said, all the cigars they were smoking were stolen. And he looks at me and he went, what? He said, what's the good news? And I said, the good news is all the evidence was destroyed in a series of small fires. And he looked at me, he closed the book, and said, have a good trip. Period. So we left July 1st. We did have a film crew on board, and there was a book deal, and there's a whole bunch of things happening that were supporting it. And we headed up north along the British Columbia coast to stops into all the small villages and communities, Sechelt, Campbell River, all the way up the coast, all through the Alaskan waters, and ended up getting up towards Diomedes. So just south of there, you have the International Date Line, you have the Arctic Circle. And it was flat calm, and one of my crew members, it's a crew of 4, myself, a navigator, an engineer, and a deckhand, had brought water skis with them. So I look out, and he's water skiing behind the Nadon. Now he's water skiing from today to tomorrow, and from above the Arctic Circle to below the Arctic Circle, and from tomorrow to today, and then back around. So he has on his wall a time-traveling water skiing certificate, St. Roch II in the year 2000. But so we come up to Diomedes Island. This is one of my favorite spots. I used to ask kids in classes this. So where am I? I said, you got 2 towns, 2 islands, 2 countries, 2 continents, 2 seas, 2 oceans, and 2 days. Where are you? And for years, kids would scratch their head and I make them go find a map where you could actually see that. And now after the space station went up, they go, well, you're on the space station looking down. So it's true. 2 towns on Diomede and Big Diomede, 2 islands, Diomede, Diomede, 2 countries, USA and Russia, 2 continents, Asia and North America, 2 seas, Chukchi, Bering, 2 oceans, Arctic and Pacific, and 2 days, today and tomorrow. We had a teacher on board from Vancouver School Board that was actually doing educational programs. So this fit right into the curriculum that was unfolding in Vancouver. Now, the Globe and Mail was our media sponsor, so you guys had a lot more media coverage out here in Eastern Canada than we did with our newspapers in British Columbia, which I think is a sad, sad statement. So as we traveled along, we interviewed and met the elders. Henry Larson used to invite the elders down to the ship for tea and biscuits, and we did the same thing. The crew members welcomed them on board. We did the interviews with the Inuit about their interactions with the St. Roch, and generally recognized and thanked a lot of the Inuit. There were a number of special constable Inuits that never received the decorations, so we made sure the decorations were delivered. And there were community events in all these communities all the way across the north. And there's also the Smoking Hills, so we stopped and we actually had a cigar, a place called the Smoking Hills. And food and drug people should, or the food and banquet people should pay attention to this, because these are the banquets we're having all the way across the Arctic. So on the left is Tuk the Uptuck. It was sponsored by the Rangers and had, the Rangers exceptional welcome for us. And the top you see Muktuk, which is narwhal or beluga skin. It's very tasty. You eat it raw. You don't eat the blubber. You ever wonder why Inuit never suffered from scurvy? This thing's chock full of vitamin C. They knew what to eat. Down below, again, more Muktuk. Now you're wearing a red serge, so if you can imagine, and this is at every single event, and the Inuit would look at us with sad eyes because we had a ham and turkey that we would, use for the event, and they had fresh meat, and they'd say, "Those poor kabluna," which means a white person having to eat that dried bird, and what's this pink thing? And there's all this fresh food here. And they call this kabluna because it either means, depending on who you're talking to, it either means people with bushy eyebrows, or it's the offspring of a poorly performing sled dog and a disobedient daughter. They're very practical people. Anyhow, and I was absolutely amazed. So the fellow on the right is an RCMP member, brand new from Montreal. And as a host, he had to carve up the dinner. And the doors open up at the far end. They drag 2 seals in right out of the harbor. He straddles them, cuts the seal from one end to the other, takes the guts. The guts go into a pail bucket for the dogs. And then you sit down and you pull back and you eat the seal. That's exactly how you do it. And so after about 8 of these, I started to smell like a dead seal, my surge, which became problematic as we were coming up at St. Lawrence because I was going to be meeting the Governor General. And I smelled so bad, I swear I'd trigger fire alarms. Anyhow, there was a relay to get my surge and clothing done along the North Shore all the way up to St. Lawrence in time to meet the Governor General. We also repatriated over 2,500 photographs back into the communities. This particular couple are walking through tours of her boat. We had tours at all the communities, and she gasped and she looked up, and it was a photograph of her mother and father, and she didn't have a photograph. So we took it right off the wall and gave it to her, that along with interactive CDs, if anyone can remember what CDs were. And we repatriated all the photographs taken by the RCMP members over the years back into the communities. And we spent about 2 weeks searching for the Erebus and Terror. We covered about 100 square miles with real high-end, high-tech, forward-looking sector sonar, which mapped the ocean surface in front of us. Didn't find anything. And we were leaving Cambridge Bay and Johaven, and this fellow came up to me on the right. His name is Louis Kamikol, and he's an Inuit scholar. He said, "You're looking for Franklin?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, If you're not doing anything tomorrow, come here, I'll show you something. So he took us to a little island called Todd Islet. And he said, what do you see? And I said, oh, I see gravel and there's nothing here. And he said, no, look closely. And I said, oh, I see moss and gravel, moss and gravel, moss and gravel. He said, moss only grows where there's something organic. And I said, you mean the grave sites? He said, yes. And it was graves of Sir John Franklin's men. And I got right down on the ground and I looked up and you could see blue material poking up through the moss. It was the burial site of Sir John Franklin's men. And just around the corner, a few, maybe 100 meters away, was a skull, probably one of Sir John Franklin's men. So as it turns out, when they did find the Erebus, we were 60 nautical miles away from the Erebus, which in the Arctic is that close. That close. Dave Woodman, an Arctic scholar, led that for us and did an exceptional job. And I was amazed at the community involvement of the members up there. I'm sure the Coast Guard was actually meeting today in town here. They saw that, they'd be going nuts. Where's the life jacket? But that's life in the Arctic. So let's take a quick peek at a bit of a video, which sums it up quite nicely.
The other day, Ken and I were in Cambridge Bay. We were getting ready to depart in Nadon. And a woman drove up with a loaf of bread. And she passed it to us, and she said, you know, she said, this reminds me that we are all so very similar. And she said, and it makes me proud to be Canadian. And she started to cry. And in that moment, I knew that there was something more that we were doing here. We were not just doing a voyage to remind people about a ship and to raise money for it. We were doing something, and we are doing something that's helping tie the country together.
Whisper in a silent land, force that leads its guiding hand, keeper of forbidden love, thought to be the pure white dove, warrior of relentless hate, born to learn we separate. The fire burns but makes no smoke, the shadow casts its cloak upon the seven wonders sleep together. Frozen into time, but we all share the future. Together we must last. With the knowledge from our ancestry, we learn from the past. Yes, we all share the future.
He remembers Henry Larson, both of them.
Contribute to one destiny, the best that we can be. A child is born as we watch it grow. There's so much that it does not know. Good and bad, what's black and white. Teach what we believe is right. When all that once what was has learned to walk, has learned to run. They live in what we've left behind. Let's leave them what we can. Yes, we all share the future. Together we must we all share the future in a mystery untold. Together we contribute to one destiny, the best that we can be. The sun has set, the light has shone, centuries have come and gone. There's a wheel that turns in the universe, the only one we can reverse. It's difficult to understand, the one who moves the hour hand may follow in our footsteps, but their memory lives on.
The Roch II is on an amazing voyage, sailing around the continent, keeping Canada on the right, visiting communities.
We learn from the past, yes, we all share the future. In each other we rely. Together we were born to live, we all got to try. Yes, we all share the future. It's a part of you and me. From the rivers to the oceans, from the land to the sea. Yes, we all share the future.
Well, my dad was here 58 years ago, and I guess he helped bury him. So, you know, it hasn't hit me until we got here now. That's a long time ago.
The girls were throat singing there. I tried it. It deteriorated into a Beatles medley, so I wouldn't recommend anyone do throat singing unless you're prepared for that. So we came down the coast, the east coast, in the St. Lawrence Seaway as far as Prescott, Ontario, for an audience with the Governor General, Adrian Clarkson of the day, back out and headed down the east coast of the United States to go back to Fort Lauderdale to the boat show, where I had that unfortunate encounter in the White Law Hotel. And on the way down, there's a lobster boat. So we pull up alongside. Actually, there's two lobster boats. There's an American lobster boat and a Canadian lobster boat. And we thought, let's have a lobster dinner. Let's celebrate. It's all downhill from here. And I look over, and the Canadian lobster fisherman has all his lobsters sitting out in open bins in nice, neat, orderly rows. And the American lobster fisherman has all his bins bungeed down with lids and tied down. No way are these lobsters ever going to get away. And I said, aren't you worried about your lobsters getting away? And the Canadian fisherman looks at me and says, no, he says, these are Canadian lobsters. When one of them gets to the top of the pile, the other ones pull them back in. There's stories there too, but I won't go into those tonight. But we'll say we headed south and we pulled into Cuba, where the original St. Roch was. They knew we were coming. We had everything in Spanish. We were good to go. And we pulled right in and were promptly arrested by the military authorities and taken into a military encampment of sorts. The crew could leave the boat. They couldn't leave the compound. I had to stay on the boat because they saw this communications array. They saw this fancy sonar, and they thought, what are those Canadians up to? And the fact that there was a Canadian sailboat, about an 85-foot sailboat, up high and dry on a reef just off of Bahia, the Hemingway Marina in Havana, with a Canadian flag on it. And the locals were coming out helping themselves to the boat. And they thought we were there to protect the owner's interest, which totally coincidental. So we ended up, my crew, being at sea for X number of weeks, found the nearest bar. And I had to stay on board. And the officials posted a guard in front of the boat, tied up at their office. And in the morning, I wake up and I always do a crew count, 1, 2, 3, 4. They're all here. I go 1, 2, 3. Oh no, we're missing somebody. I'm missing one of my crew members in Cuba. This isn't a good thing. And I get up into the wheelhouse and I look down, and the guard is sitting there kind of laughing. And I look up and my crew member's curled up at the guard's feet, sound asleep. And shortly thereafter, the Canadian ambassador showed up and got us out of Hawk. And we were quickly on our way. So we got arrested on the north side of Cuba. We went around to the south side, and we were on the front page of Grandma, which Eric has a fascinating story about that he can tell in some other time. And that's our commanding officer's executive officer reading the official newspaper of the Communist Party of Cuba. And we were national heroes. Arrested on one side, national heroes on the other. So after 169 days and 24,000 nautical miles, we arrived back in Vancouver. I will digress. There's one little quick story I got to tell you about fueling in Mexico. Pulled into Puerto Madero, Mexico, and we had to go over see the port captain, pay the $1,000, $2,000, $3,000, whatever it was to get fuel. Go over to the fuel dock. The hose came down, and this little 19-year-old jumps down on the dock. He goes, "My name is Manuel. I am your translator." And I said, "Well, we all speak Spanish, so no, I don't need a translator." He goes, "My name is Manuel. I'm your translator." And I said, "You don't speak English, do you?" And he goes, "I am your translator." "Well, just stand over there, stay out of the way." We fuel up, and he kept saying, "My name is Manuel, I'm your translator." I think that's the only English he knew. So we all finished, and it's going up, and he goes, "Translation fee, $20. And I looked at him and said, this 17-year-old kid's trying to strong-arm me. $20 translation fee. And I went, "You don't speak English." He went, $20 translation fee. And I went, "Policia, $20 translation fee." No, real mandat de police do Canada, Royal Canadian Mounted Police, $20 translation fee. I took him over to the side of the boat and I pointed the word police out on the side. And I went, "Federales." And he looked at me, he turned white, he reached into his pocket and he gave me $20. I swear to God, we laughed so hard, I gave him his $20 back and another $20 because it was the funniest thing we had heard in a long, long time. So after 169 days, we arrived back in Vancouver on December 16th. We set a number of world records, one of them which still stands. Fastest circumnavigation of North America for a non-ice strengthened vessel. So yeah, and it's kind of exciting. I was 6'1" when I left and 180 pounds, and I was 5'11" and 220 pounds when I got back because we just pounded like that all through the Atlantic. But it was an amazing trip, which set the tone for what I call the Grand Tour. So the Dawn is now owned by the Vancouver Maritime Museum, and it's being prepared for an exhibit as part of the year 2000 marine technology and a world record-setting voyage. So stay tuned for that. But I'm going to talk quickly about the Grand Tour, about what's really happening up there. Because since I left the RCMP, I became not only the director of the museum, but I ended up working on a variety of Arctic vessels, all kinds, private vessels, commercial vessels, cruise companies. I work with a company called EOS, and one called One Ocean that is actually Russian research vessels that are chartered, the Yoffi and the Vavilov. Now, if you really want to mess with somebody, I was the director of security for Western Canada in the RCMP. So I got a picture of myself standing behind the wheel of a Russian ship, driving it in Canadian waters. And I sent it to my boss, and I said, "There's lots of work out there." and really, it really wreaks havoc with your security clearance. I'll tell you that. Anyhow, so these are Russian ships. This is one I'm on now, and I kept wondering, where's the crew going? Because the crew disappears, and they go up. They're over in the Northeast Passage, and they're doing something over there. They're working on ships. These ships are based in Kaliningrad, so Petersburg, Kaliningrad, the Baltic, and they're up in the Northeast Passage. And I was curious what they were doing. And what I want to share with you here in the next couple of real fast slides is what I think they're doing. So the Arctic countries are the United States, Canada, Greenland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia. Nowhere in there should we see China. But you're going to see China here in a minute. So a little bit of sort of environmental scan of what's happening in Canada right now in the high Arctic, and this is fairly current, along with the Rangers, which are in every community, the Defense and Early Warning System. There's a base military presence in Iqaluit, and this drives me nuts. This is on Devon Island. It's called the Canadian Acoustic Underwater Science Experiment. It's a top secret facility. You don't see that on any charts. You don't see that on any maps. Do you know where you find it? You find it on the government posting website looking for people to bid on building something here. And you find it on academic sites where people are getting research grants to do underwater acoustics. And it's there, but you don't see it. It's actually quite a large facility, and they are releasing autonomous underwater submersibles into Lancaster Sound and up Wellington Channel, and they're looking for, what do you think they're looking for? Russian submarines. Exactly. There's the High Arctic Research Center in Cambridge Bay, which does high Arctic research. It also monitors nuclear testing worldwide. So there's things happening in the Arctic. You just start thinking about it a little bit. And we, of course, have the new frigates, the new coastal patrol boats. One of them just ran aground in Hawaii. That must be embarrassing. I don't know how that happens, but it happens. Resolute is a main base. When I was up there 3 weeks ago, the Rangers were doing their standard patrols that they do in their ATVs. They look very nice, but probably 1950s, 1960s vintage. I worry about the modern warfare with the Rangers. And at the very top, we have Alert and Eureka, which are really weather stations. And that, in essence, is most of the Arctic. The U.S. have Space Command located in Thule, which is the new Space Command, which is probably a really good spot for them. And along with that, most people don't realize there's 2 Mars analog space stations on Devon Island. So astronauts that are training for the Artemis mission to the moon and astronauts that are training for the Mars missions, every single one of them trains on Devon Island. And there's not 1, but 2 bases. And we were supposed to go there last month. We got weathered out, couldn't get there. So it's an exciting area. There's a lot of high-tech things up there. And a lot of you folks didn't realize that. There's actually Mars stations, space stations, and there's fancy science happening there. There's a lot of vulnerabilities. Along with that, there's a lot of oil and gas in the Arctic. The area above the Arctic Circle has an estimated 90 billion barrels of undiscovered oil. The Arctic accounts for 13% of undiscovered oil, 30% of undiscovered natural gas, 20% of undiscovered natural gas and liquids. Everywhere, all across the top of Russia, Beaufort Sea, northern Canada, Greenland, Baffin Bay, and over into Sweden and Norway. So the Russians have a lot of bases on the Russian side, along with mines and resources and interests. And of course, the bun fight over who actually owns the North Pole. Is it us? Is it the Russians? Is it the Chinese? Is it the Danish? Who actually owns it? And but back to the bases. So this is what a lot of people I was working with on the Vavilov and the Yaffe were on ships supporting these bases, and they're modernizing them. They're reopening them. They got 13 active military bases on the Russian side of the border. And we have 2 weather stations on our side. And I was wondering, are they launching long-range aircraft? They're going to fly over Washington, bomb it, and continue down to Cuba? Just what are they doing up there? And billions of dollars in infrastructure going into the Arctic. And I really had to scratch my head. And it was more than just Russia making a claim for the North Pole, which they did in 2007. They dropped a flag at the North Pole. They had an ice camp on the ice at the North Pole. You can see the letter there with the bear hugging the North Pole. It's more than that. And so I exploded the problem. I said, what are they really doing? Let's go back to square one, exploded the problem, had a closer look. Russia has more ice-capable vessels, many of them nuclear powered, than all of the NATO countries, Finland, Sweden, and China combined. You got to think about that. Russia has 57, the Allies have 47. That's a lot of machinery up there. And this is a snow dragon. It's not 1, it's not 2, it's 3 icebreakers that are built and deployed by China. And China doesn't have any ice. And I actually ran into this at the Great Wall, which is a major Chinese weather and science station in Antarctica. Okay, so they have a beef down there, but there's nothing in the Arctic that should be seeing China go up there. So I did a little more digging, and I find out this thing is happening. It's called the Polar Express. Sounds pretty innocuous. It's 12,650 mile subsea fiber optic cable going from essentially Petersburg all the way through the Northeast Passage, down around the Kamchatka Peninsula, coming back into the Russian, North Korean, and Chinese border. It's a fiber optic cable. It's buried 1.5 meters deep under the bottom of the ocean. So not only is it laying on the bottom of the ocean, they buried it 1.5 meters. It has 150 optical amplifiers to boost the signal. And get this, the capability is 104 terabytes of information per second. And it goes live in 2026. It's already built. And when you consider 99% of the world's information flows on fiber, that's something to really, really think long and hard about. What are they doing? Canada has a small one that goes over our north, but nowhere near this capability. This is big news, and it has happened almost unnoticed in the Western world. So I took a closer look at the undersea cabling. There was a Russian vessel, the star in the middle there, hovering around off the Irish coast, which caused some anxiety. In the upper right, there's two cables that go. It's a Space Norway facility, goes from Norway to Svalbard. There's two of them. Last year, someone cut one of the cables. It's 2,700 meters deep. One of them got cut. Now, how important is that? Well, there's 100 antennas sitting in Svalbard that controls all the satellites, all the commercial satellites anyhow. So if you wanted to control your satellite, you would get on your computer, you would link through Space Norway to Svalbard, and the signal would go up. Somebody cut one of the cables. And I got thinking about, I wonder, could that be what the issue is with Taiwan? So I took a closer look at Taiwan, because Taiwan's in the news, isn't it? Taiwan is this soft spot. There's 15 submarine fiber optic cables coming into Taiwan, coming into 7 landing stations. 3 of them are Chinese. And with the flip of a switch, Taiwan can turn off China's internet connections just about worldwide. Do you think that might be part of the reason that China has an interest in Taiwan? I would submit it is. So what's China up to? Something very innocuous. It's called the Belt Road Initiative. Involves 155 countries, 32 international organizations. China is in the midst of investing $8 trillion American to build this. It will increase the world gross domestic product by 7.1 trillion per year and reduce cost of shipping. The target date is 2049. Well, just what is the Belt and Road Initiative? And this is an extremely simplified version. Essentially, it's a land corridor from China across Asia into Europe. It's also a sea corridor, which includes the Northeast Passage. Remember, we saw the Northeast Passage? That can see goods go up Northeast Passage and come into Europe from the north. And their whole program deals with sending consumer goods into Europe and North America and returning with raw materials. That's why it's called a belt. And what really gave me shivers down my spine when I was looking at this, there's an area called the Central Asia Middle Corridor, which is part of it. And the Central Asia Middle Corridor goes right through the center of the Ukraine. And I'm thinking, you got China and Russia doing maneuvers right now, and they're friends with North Korea. And I think you're looking at a major new trading pact emerging from China, Russia, and North Korea using the Northeast Passage. And the term is neo-colonialism, the use of economic, political, cultural, and other pressures to control or influence other countries, especially former dependencies. And I got that done in 54 minutes. So I don't know if that's the end or if it's just the beginning, but it's what I see from 30 years in the Arctic, spending a lot of time on boats and hanging out with Russians drinking vodka. Thank you very much.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, This is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now, and thank you for joining us.